There's a character, physically the strongest fighter in his entire organization, who cries constantly for strangers, for enemies, for children he never met. He prays before every fight, mourns every death he causes even when it's necessary, and treats every living thing, no matter how monstrous, with a gentleness that seems completely at odds with how much raw power he actually carries. And here's the part that should stop you. This man was once sentenced to death for a massacre he didn't commit, blamed by an entire community for a tragedy he was actively trying to prevent when it happened. He had every reason imaginable to walk away from faith, from gentleness, from believing in anything good about the people around him ever again. He didn't. His name is Gyomei Himejima. And today you're going to find out what he understood about holding on to faith that you, having faced far less injustice than he did, still let go of so easily. Think about how naturally most of us would justify becoming hard, distrustful, closed off after something like this. Nobody would question it. If Gyomei had come out of this story cold and guarded, every single person watching would understand completely, maybe even expect it. That's exactly what makes the fact that he didn't so worth examining closely. Before he became one of the strongest demon slayers in the organization's history, Gyomei lived a quiet life at a small temple, helping care for orphan children alongside a monk who had taken him in and raised him. He wasn't training to fight anything. He was simply devoted to the children in his care, to the values the temple stood for, to a life built around gentleness rather than violence. Even then, physically massive and unusually strong for his age, Gyomei was known less for his strength than for his tenderness. He looked after the youngest, most vulnerable children with a patience most adults struggle to maintain, treating the responsibility of caring for them as something sacred rather than burdensome. Hold on to that image, because everything that happens next is going to test whether a person built this gently can survive contact with genuine, undeserved catastrophe. There's something worth naming about the specific kind of goodness Gyomei practices before any of this happens. Because it isn't performative or occasional, it's the quiet, unglamorous, everyday kind. Nobody was watching him care for those children in ways that would earn him recognition or reward. He wasn't being gentle because gentleness was strategically useful to him in some way. He was gentle because that's simply who he was when nothing was at stake and no one was scoring him on it. That distinction matters enormously for what comes later because it means the tragedy that follows isn't punishing a performance, it's punishing something completely genuine. A devastating flood hits the region during a storm, and in the chaos, disaster strikes the temple. A man who had secretly been sheltering there, someone with a violent hidden past who had lied about who he really was, abandons the children to the rising water instead of helping save them, escaping into the chaos of the storm. Gyomei, desperately trying to save everyone he can in the darkness and confusion, ends up in a horrifying case of mistaken identity. In the panic and near blindness of the storm, he kills the very monk who raised him, mistaking him for the dangerous man who was actually responsible for the unfolding catastrophe. The real culprit escapes entirely. The children, despite everything Gyomei tries to do, don't survive the flood. Sit with the scale of this for a second. In a single night, Gyomei loses the children he'd devoted himself to protecting, and with his own hands, in a horrifying accident born entirely out of trying to save people, kills the one person who'd raised him and shaped everything he believed in. There's a specific horror embedded in this that's worth being precise about, because it's not the same shape as most tragedies. This isn't a story about a good man failing to prevent something terrible happening to him from the outside. It's a story about a good man's own hands becoming the instrument of the worst part of the tragedy through no malice, no negligence, nothing but darkness, chaos, and a case of mistaken identity that could have happened to virtually anyone in his position. He doesn't just lose people that night. He has to live the rest of his life knowing his own actions, taken in good faith, caused irreversible harm to the person he loved most. When the survivors and the surrounding village piece together what happened, they don't get the full picture. What they see is Gyomei, covered in blood, the only person left standing near the bodies of the children and the monk. The actual killer, the man who abandoned the children and vanished into the storm, is never found, never connected to what happened. Gyomei is arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. blamed entirely for a massacre he spent that entire night desperately trying to prevent. The community that once knew him as the gentle boy who cared tenderly for orphan children now sees him only as a monster capable of killing them. This is worth sitting with directly because it's about as close as a story can get to the purest possible version of injustice. A person punished completely and severely for the exact opposite of what they actually did. He didn't fail to care. He didn't act with cruelty. He tried with everything he had to save people, and the world's response was to condemn him to die for it. There's a specific cruelty worth naming in how completely the village's misunderstanding erases everything Gyomei actually was before that night. Years of genuine devotion, of caring for children nobody else wanted, of living exactly the life his faith asked of him. None of it counts for anything once the village settles on its version of events. A single night of horrific misfortune becomes the entire story people tell about him, overwriting everything real that came before it. That's a particular kind of erasure that goes beyond the injustice of the punishment itself. It's watching an entire life's worth of genuine character get discarded in favor of the simplest, most damning explanation available. Awaiting execution with seemingly no path forward and no one left to advocate for him. Gyomei is approached by Sakonji Urokodaki, a former demon slayer who through his own investigation recognizes that Gyomei's story doesn't match the official account. Urokodaki sees what the village couldn't, a man devastated by loss, not a murderer. Urokodaki secures Gyomei's release under the condition that he become a demon slayer, trading a death sentence for a life dedicated to fighting the actual monsters responsible for tragedies like the one that destroyed everything he loved. Gyomei accepts, not out of relief exactly, but as the only path left that lets what happened to him mean something beyond senseless loss. Think about what it would take to accept a second chance like this without it curdling into something bitter. Gyomei isn't given an apology from the village that condemned him. He isn't given back the children or the mentor he accidentally killed while trying to save them. He's given only a chance to keep living, doing something that might prevent other families from suffering what his did. And he takes it fully, without demanding the world make amends first. There's a version of this rescue that could have easily produced someone very different. Gyomei could have accepted the offer purely as an escape from execution, taken the second chance while privately deciding that the world had shown him exactly what it was. Cruel, quick to judge, unworthy of his continued devotion, and simply gone through the motions of his new role without ever really believing in anything again. That version of the character would have been completely understandable. It's just not who he becomes. Over the years that follow, Gyomei becomes the physically strongest Hashira in the entire organization, capable of feats of raw power none of his peers can match. And yet, unlike what you might expect from someone who endured what he endured, he doesn't become hardened, cynical, or emotionally closed off because of it. If anything, he becomes more openly gentle, more visibly emotional, more willing to grieve and pray and weep in front of people who might expect a warrior of his strength to show none of that. This is the detail worth sitting with longest because it directly contradicts what most of us assume trauma does to a person. We tend to expect severe injustice to either break someone completely or force them to armor up, to stop feeling as deeply as a form of self-protection. Gyomei does neither. He holds on to exactly the tenderness that defined him before the tragedy, refusing to let what happened convince him that gentleness was ever the mistake. You know people, maybe you are one, who let a single instance of severe unfairness convince them that caring, trusting, or believing in anything good was naive all along. I got burned once, so now I protect myself by expecting the worst. Gyomei was burned in the most severe way this story can construct, and still refuses to let that conclusion win. There's a specific kind of strength worth distinguishing here from the more common version we usually celebrate. We tend to admire people who get physically or emotionally tougher after hardship, who build thicker skin, who stop letting things affect them as much. Gyomei's strength runs in the opposite direction. His body becomes immensely powerful, arguably the most physically capable person in his entire organization, while his emotional openness, his willingness to be moved to tears by other people's suffering, only grows more pronounced. He becomes simultaneously the hardest person in the room to defeat physically and the softest person in the room emotionally, refusing to treat those two things as contradictory. One of the most distinctive things about Gyomei, compared to almost every other demon slayer in the story, is that he prays, sincerely, consistently, for the souls of the demons he's forced to kill. He doesn't treat them purely as enemies to be eliminated without a second thought. He treats every death, even a necessary one, as something worth mourning, worth honoring, with genuine sorrow rather than satisfaction. This connects directly back to the tragedy that shaped him. Gyomei knows more intimately than almost anyone what it feels like to be misjudged, to have your actions completely misunderstood by people who weren't there to see the full truth. Rather than let that experience make him quick to judge or dismiss others, including demons, it seems to have made him slower to do so, someone who extends the benefit of understanding even to creatures the rest of the world has already decided are beyond it. There's something worth naming about how unusual this response actually is. The far more common reaction to severe injustice is to become someone who judges harshly and quickly, precisely because you've learned firsthand how much damage a rushed, incomplete judgment can cause. Gyomei goes the opposite direction. Having been on the receiving end of that exact kind of harm, he becomes someone determined never to inflict a smaller version of it on anyone else, demon or otherwise. This extends even to how he treats the demons he's forced to fight and kill, creatures with genuinely monstrous histories responsible for real suffering. Gyomei doesn't excuse what they've done. He simply refuses to treat the act of killing them as something to celebrate or feel satisfaction over, choosing instead to mourn the loss of whatever human life existed before the demon did, honoring that lost humanity with the same sincerity he'd want extended to his own memory if the situation were reversed. Here's where most people misread a story like this. They assume that holding on to faith or hope after something this unjust must require some kind of denial, pretending it didn't happen, minimizing how badly you were wronged, forcing yourself into forgiveness you don't actually feel. Gyomei never does that. He doesn't pretend the tragedy wasn't real, doesn't pretend the village's judgment of him wasn't a devastating betrayal, doesn't pretend the mentor he lost isn't still mourned deeply even years later. He carries all of it, fully, visibly, and still chooses to keep believing that gentleness, devotion, and prayer are worth practicing anyway. Real faith, the way Gyomei lives it, isn't bad things don't really happen to good people. It's bad things happen to me that I did nothing to deserve, and I'm choosing to keep believing in meaning and goodness anyway, not because the injustice wasn't real, but because letting it convert me into someone hard and closed off would be its own kind of loss layered on top of the first one. Can you hold that same distinction in your own life? Fully acknowledging real unfairness done to you while still refusing to let it convince you that trust, faith, or gentleness were mistakes all along. Or does one instance of being wronged quietly become permission to close yourself off from all of it going forward? This distinction is worth applying honestly to situations far smaller than Gyomei's, because most of us never face anything close to his level of injustice, yet plenty of us make the exact trade he refuses to make over far less. A single betrayal becomes the reason you stop trusting anyone new. One bad experience with vulnerability becomes proof that vulnerability itself was the mistake. We tend to treat our worst experiences as data proving that our best qualities were naive, rather than treating them as painful exceptions that don't actually disprove anything about the value of those qualities in the first place. Now, forget about Gyomei for a second and think about you. Think about the moment you were treated unfairly, accused of something you didn't do, blamed for an outcome you tried to prevent, judged by people who never bothered to learn the full story. Think about how that moment might still be quietly shaping how much you trust people, how much benefit of the doubt you're willing to extend, how guarded you've become since then. Gyomei was sentenced to death for a tragedy he spent an entire night desperately trying to stop. He lost the children in his care and the mentor who raised him in the same night. through no fault of his own, and was then condemned by the very community he'd devoted his life to serving. And he still, every single day afterward, chooses prayer over bitterness, tears over hardness, gentleness over the armor almost anyone else would have reasonably built after that. And you, with injustices that are almost certainly smaller, have probably let far less severe unfairness convince you that guardedness is simply wisdom now, that trusting people is something you used to be naive enough to do before you knew better. Think about the specific shape this takes in your own life. The friend who let you down once, quietly demoted to someone you keep at arm's length for good, regardless of how many times they've shown up for you since. The industry, profession, or type of person you've written off entirely because one bad experience convinced you the whole category couldn't be trusted. The version of yourself, open, generous, quick to give people the benefit of the doubt, that you retired after getting hurt once, treating that retirement as maturity rather than what it actually might be. A smaller, more protected life, purchased at the cost of exactly the qualities that made the larger one worth living. Gyomei isn't gentle because life was fair to him. He's gentle despite one of the most severe injustices imaginable, losing everyone he loved in a single night and then being condemned for it by the people he served. His faith wasn't the product of an easy life. It was a choice, made repeatedly, in spite of everything that should have reasonably destroyed it. You don't have to resolve every injustice you've experienced today. You don't have to suddenly trust everyone, forgive everyone, or believe in goodness without reservation just because you watched a video on YouTube. But maybe you can start by asking yourself, honestly, what unfair moment from your own life you've let quietly write the rules for how guarded you are now, and whether Gyomei's example suggests that the injustice, however real, was never actually a good enough reason to give up on gentleness altogether. There's one final thing worth carrying out of this, because it's tempting to treat Gyomei's story as proof that everything works out in the end if you just keep enough faith. That's not quite the argument being made here. He never gets the apology he deserves. The village never learns the truth. The mentor he lost stays lost permanently, with no reunion or resolution waiting for him later in the story. His faith doesn't get rewarded with the universe correcting its mistake. It just gets to keep existing on its own terms, regardless of whether the injustice that tested it was ever actually resolved. That might be the harder, more honest version of this lesson. Not that goodness gets vindicated eventually, but that it's worth holding on to even when it never does.